This session is a panel discussion on reasons why Borlaug was successful and how he might do things differently today. My name is Andrew Barr. I'm the Chairman of the Board of Trustees of CIMMYT. My job is to facilitate this discussion. So when the organising panel met about this discussion, they considered who could do that job. Oprah Winfrey was busy for the day. Michael Parkinson is watching the Cricket World T20 in India. And fortunately, they went back to what Norman Borlaug himself would be wanting to have happen. And I guess it's fair to say that he might think a muddy-footed plant breeder and farmer like myself was perhaps the right person to facilitate that. I hope at the end of this session you agree with that assessment. Borlaug came to Australia around 2004, I think it was that year. He visited a plant breeding program I was involved with at the time, and he intensely grilled us. In fact, I've been through formal reviews that were less stringent. He asked us every aspect of what we were doing in our breeding program. He asked us about the rate of genetic advance, of the number of generations we did per year, the technologies we were using, the number of plots we were capable of managing, and made us, at the end of the day, I think intellectually exhausted, but thoroughly challenged and refreshed by the experience. He was fascinated by the research funding model in Australia, where every cropping farmer contributes a percentage of his farm gate income to fund the research that's done in Australia. And that perhaps was one thing that he took away from our visit. So back to the topic at hand. I think today we've heard a great deal about why Norman Borlaug was successful. So perhaps the emphasis in this session should swing slightly more towards how Norm would approach that task were it starting today. So when I was thinking about that issue, I wondered what technical advances would appeal to Norm, whether transgenesis, genomics, molecular markers, data management, informatics, better experimental designs, G by E, those sorts of things would appeal. I'm certain he would have been very excited tailoring his varieties into the current technologies available in conservation agriculture and precision ag. How would he have handled the R&D environment today? How would he work in a 21st century work environment? Would he be able to broker the release of a GM wheat? And how would he handle the policy environment? They're just some of the questions that I considered and we discussed with the panellists this morning. So now I should introduce our panellists to you. Firstly, we have Phil Pardey, who's an agricultural economist at the University of Minnesota. Marco Quinones is a senior director of the Ethiopian Agricultural Transformation Agency and worked very closely with Borlaug in the 70s and 80s. Marco. Thank you. Lele is an independent scholar and development economist. Pat Wall was an agronomist with CIMMYT for many years, working in the conservation agriculture and farming systems area, and is now retired. Zhonghu is a wheat breeder from CIMMYT and based in Beijing. So that is our panel. We will have a short presentation from each of those panellists. It will be quite short to summarise their perspectives of this issue. We will entertain questions from the floor to engage you. When that happens, I'm looking for the word succinct. We don't want long soliloquies from the floor. We want to have an active interaction with you. So with no further ado, I'll introduce perhaps Phil to start.
Thanks very much. I met Norm on several occasions, did not work with him, but as I say, I had the privilege of meeting him occasionally. I was struck from what I know of Norm and from seeing the commentary this morning that I didn't see a photo of Norm sitting behind a desk. He was always out in the field, he was interacting with scientists or with students and so forth. And we've heard a lot of commentary about his personal characteristics of tenacity and some would perhaps say stubbornness, He was a risk taker. He was also lucky in terms of perhaps his shuttle breeding. Serendipitously and perhaps with not much foresight gave him the capacity for wide adaptability for his material. He was lucky in the sense that Norin 10 material moved through Vogel to Washington State down to here at a time that fitted into his program. And so those are well known to us all. What I wanted to sort of reflect a little bit on was this concept of the research landscape or environment within which he worked. I've asked around over the last few days, and it's probably fair to say that Norm never wrote a project proposal. Certainly probably for the first 20 years of his career in Mexico, and probably thereafter spent little possibly or any time fundraising or servicing funds or things of that nature. The nature of the environment within international research, within the CG in particular, is such that I would estimate from my straw poll here and at other centres that managers at his level in the research organisation are spending at least 50, 60, 70% of their time engaged in that sort of activity. I think that signals a funding arrangement and structure that's broken given the nature of the task at hand, and that there needs to, and I know folks have talked about that on and off, but I think it's a really serious impediment. I don't think Norm would stand for that. I think he'd be pretty insistent on trying to change that structure in ways that didn't abdicate accountability but allowed for a much longer time lag in terms of, whilst he was impatient, he also had a vision, and he knew that it was going to take time to realise that vision. And so I think there's huge sort of inefficiencies at the moment in terms of the funding mechanisms that are in place for the international system, and I see, despite repeated attempts at trying to renew and reshape those funding arrangements and those institutional structures, things are getting worse, not better. So my remark would be that I think Norm wouldn't stand for that, to the best I know him, and he would insist on some change so that there was a better matching of the nature of the funding and the commitments for that funding to the task at hand.
Would anyone like to take on Phil on that statement? Nobody game?
I'll be preaching to converted.
You may well be. We'll move to Marco, and we'll come back to that subject as people have time to digest it.
Thank you. I'd like to continue with the same tone of my predecessor, because 30 years ago, I was invited by Norm Borlaug to come to Africa, and we went, and for 30 years we had never written until today a project proposal or a project. But still, the institution which I worked for nearly 24 years, Sasakawa Global 2000, which some of my friends from Sasakawa are here today, and I welcome them to my hometown. We were extremely successful in increasing production and productivity in the country where Sasakawa was working by using a common sense on research and technology. And of course, we had the opportunity to work at the policy level as well with heads of state and ministers and planners that provided some of the working ground for the program to be successful. But I like to focus more on what the future, if Norma were still with us, what he would do today. I like to just focus on, as a researcher, and I was a researcher for more than 20 years with CIMMYT and the Mexican Institute as well. Researchers basically should be positioned in two different areas, which until today they are not. One is on the professional intellect, that researchers are always trying to explore the frontiers of knowledge. always asking questions and seeking for answers, which is very much the job of a researcher. But at the same time, researchers should also have a social commitment to make sure that whatever comes as a product of research eventually is translated to use. Any knowledge which gets stored in a shelf at the research station or at the whatever area where the researcher may be working is completely useless unless it's taken to the ground, unless it's applied by the farmer. And that was the passion of Norm Borlaug. He did not want to be judged by the number of research papers that could be published, by the tons of grain that a farmer was producing. And when we went to Africa 30 years ago, he always was saying that our program will be judged by quintals, which is by sacks of grain on the farmers' fields, not by papers. And that holds even today. So basically, I would like to see researchers trying to forge a kind of partnerships where working side by side with policymakers on the top area, planners and decision makers, and at the lower levels with the extension and farmers to see how production can be increased. Because if a wheat variety, which in the Yaqui Valley, for instance, is producing 7 to 10 tons per hectare, the same varieties, when we take them in Africa, they produce only 1.5 or 2 tons. But it's the same variety. But the soils are depleted. So research needs also to look at how we can bring back the fertility of the soils, and at the same time, how we can disseminate knowledge to farmers in a way that we can increase productivity. And maybe by the time when increases in production and productivity goes 2 or 3-fold, then we can go back to look at how can we go up again to increase the frontier of yield on the new varieties. But what is the point of having varieties that takes 20 tons or more than 20 tons per hectare when farmers are still harvesting only 2 or 3? So this, to me, is the social responsibility that we have. Thank you.
Any quick points for Marco?
¿Comentario o pregunta sobre esto?
Yep. Just where you go.
Sorry.
Okay.
Marco, you are right.
I'm sorry. Lo siento, no puedo traducir, no está hablando al micrófono.
Those times have changed. And
a new responsibility of the scientists is also to engage with policymakers and other members of the food chain so that the food chain, the value chain, function in a sustainable way. Yes, the main responsibility is the yield for the farmer and the tons of grains, but I would say that in these days things have changed and Dr. Borlaug would see how to engage into that.
2 questions up the back. 2 short statements, please, or questions.
Very short. I saw for the first time Dr. Marco Quinones, and I would like to remind him one of his trainees who got the virus of Dr. Borlaug, and his name is Lamari Lakhdar. He died, unfortunately. He became Canadian by obligation. He's the one who discovered Septoria triticeri pentis. And he published more papers and discovered also the genes of resistance for this disease, which was really impeding durum wheat production in many places. So I just want to make the point that if you are a Borlaug fellow, you really make the difference. You can make the difference. If you were infected by the virus of work from Dr. Borlaug and all the other people who were taking care of the trainees, you can become someone. He was a trainee in 1973. I followed him in 1974.
Thank you. Tony.
Well, I'd make the point that I think these days, much more so than in your time in the program, Marco, good scientists, even in applied science, need to publish. They need to be able to present to their peers what they're doing. The exercise of publishing helps them think about what they're doing. And unfortunately, they need to have publications to convince the donors. All I'd say is the donors need to read the papers and not look at the citation index.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Good day.
Well, we get the microphone over here.
Well, my question
wait a minute.
So this is both to Marco and Phil, actually. Considering the time taken between the intervention, the research, and the impact, and the difficulty of attribution, how can we evolve the reward system for scientists to recognize their contribution when it is so difficult nowadays to go from the very high-end intervention we're seeing here at CIMMYT and the quintals in the field in 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, there are scientists that work in different institutional structures that get incentivised in different ways. I think getting in an environment where you can have some more surety of funding than exists in the CG system for today. I'm not arguing for doing away with competitive pressures in science funding and so forth, but I'm arguing for rebalancing the funding, and I think that it's rewards and access to resources, both salary plus lab-related resources and so forth, that drive and incentivise scientists. And at the moment, I think there's way too much deadweight cost being imposed on scientists for doing things other than science, and translating that science into market change. It's a different sort of relationship, I think, as another speaker mentioned, and that the external relationships between the scientists and CIMMYT and that market chain have changed. But there's not enough attention, in my view, or space being given to really optimise and think through and implement those sorts of activities, given this slippage away from when I joined the CG in '84, I think it was 82% core funding. It's probably less than 20% now for CIMMYT and most other centres, and I think that's really inhibiting the progression of both the conduct of science and the progression into technical change.
Just a short comment on incentivisation of scientists. In my home university, they look on one variety released and adopted as equivalent to 5 scientific papers. So maybe Norm would be pretty comfortable in that environment.
Ethiopian situation, nowadays the extension methodology, we know that it is better to train up or to disseminate, rather than to individual person, rather than to disseminate through community approaches. So in Ethiopia, since you have been working on 20 years, so have you adopted this principle, just to train up the farmers or end users in community approaches? If you do so, then what is the advantage? And if you will do so, then will you think about this?
Basically what I tried to say in a nutshell is that we cannot solve the problems of food production by producing varieties alone. I'm not saying that we should stop on that, but what I'm saying is that the researchers should spend also more time on moving technology to the users. And one of the problems which is across all the developing countries, both in Latin America as well as in Africa, is soil fertility depletion. Nutrients are missing in the soils that have been exploited for too long. And a variety, no matter how good a variety is, if you starve that variety from nutrition, it will not produce half of what it should have. So researchers should try to become more across disciplines, not only becoming a breeder or a pathologist or a soil scientist, but everybody should try to learn on what the variety potential is, what the kind of adaptation or resistance to diseases and so on, but also what type of nutrition we can provide to them, and try to disseminate that knowledge to the end user, who are the farmers. And of course, we need to also work out with the policymakers to make sure that the varieties are multiplied, that the inputs are brought into the country on time, that there is credit available for the farmers who do not have resources to buy cash, and so on. And eventually even to be able to market whatever the farmer is produced at a price which is very reasonable to them. I'm not talking something which is something new. Even our predecessors in this afternoon presentations, I was very happy when I hear them telling exactly what needs to be done. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to Pat and take some more questions after Pat.
Thank you, Andy. Why was Norm so effective, and what would he do now? I think exactly the same. He solved immediate farmer problems and solve them fast and get them out to the farm. So that was his main focus, and he would be doing that again today. With respect to the Green Revolution, we heard about the critics and the critics in the 1970s. If India and Pakistan had waited until they could get perfect and perfectly sustainable packages before they moved those to the farmer, millions of people, more people would have died. Norm was not about that. He would move it out fast, look for the second generation problems, and then get those solved. And that's what he would, I think, be doing today. He had the vision of the value chain that you were talking about, Javier. And the value chain, he worked on the value chain before it was called a value chain. Everything from the breeding, the agronomy, the policy, the markets, the seed production, the shipping of the seed from Mexico to India and Pakistan. He was involved in it all. Unfortunately, I was a physiologist, and he didn't see physiology as part of that value chain. And so that caused for some abrasions at times. But he respected that. Then, how did he manage to get to the politicians? He had the charisma, and he did manage to establish those links and talk one-to-one with the politicians. I don't know whether he would be able to have that access today. Possibly he would, and I find that very difficult to judge in this changing world, whether he would have that access. But it was definitely a part of his success, his charisma in being able to talk to the leaders, to the Minister of Agriculture of India, and get policies changed, get the minister. He shamed the minister into changing policy. And that was what made it successful and what made things happen. Now, what would Norm do today? I don't think Norm would be working with the CGIAR system today. I think before it got to this stage, he would have slammed his fist down on the table. I can just hear him. God damn it! And he would have resigned, and he would have gone back to the private sector, where he would be given funding that he could prove himself, and if he didn't prove himself, he would be out. But I can't see Norm sitting down and writing a log frame, writing an M&E matrix, writing an impact assessment for 5, 10, and 15 years. I just don't see it.
Perhaps one of the privileges of being retired, Pat, is you any comments or questions on Pat's points? Can we?
Still have the access to the policy
Just wait a second, we'll get you a microphone.
I'm sorry. I'd like to respond to the answer by your good self that we do not know whether he would have the same charisma and the aptitude and the ability to actually reach out to the politicians in today's world. And I believe that he had that charisma at that time, but he would have the same acumen because he was determined to do that. In 2000, when he came to Pakistan after 40 years, first he came in 1960s, he again met everybody, right from the president down. And he made it possible that he should be able to see them. And I think that was what is about his personality. Scientist, but one who reaches very down as well as very top. He went to the Murray station where from, at that time, the material was tested against rust. And he insisted that he will write on the same page what he wrote 40 years ago. And he acknowledged everybody from that period and the people who were working in Murray this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my comments are, first, yes, I witnessed that Norm had access to people, but I think the bigger question is, will anybody else ever? And I think not. I think the situation is different, and no one is going to emerge as another Norm Borlaug. We still have Swaminathan and others. I want to say that I want to amplify what Ronnie said earlier. He said that Norm was a man on message, and when he'd meet with ministers, heads of state, he had a very simple, straightforward message of what needed to be done. And I think we need to do a better job of this. We could speak for weeks about how researchers should have impact. We have something called G-Card that wraps itself around the slightly ill-defined but nonetheless principle of agricultural research for development. Yet it hasn't been mentioned once this week. And I would urge that the community somehow decide what do we call what it is we should be doing in a way that young people can know, policymakers can know, because that enables publication, it enables scientific advance, but also links research to impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Swapan.
He was successful in working in a freedom to operate, no IP involved in it. And today's in the genomics era, how would he handle the IP protected regime?
Anyone want to have a go at that one?
Maybe he would have cried. He was a champion on moving germplasm the world over. Free movement of germplasm.
We'll go to the middle at the back here while Ken gets a microphone. Yep.
I'm Ibrahim, Texas A&M
short comments,
University.
please.
I'm going to be very concise. I would say that, if Dr. Borlaug was here today, he wouldn't have liked it for us to be thinking about him like a God-like deity who can do it all on his own. Because it takes a system to do all of this. And that's a genius of Dr. Borlaug and his legacy. He was able to lead by example and train people like Rajaram and inspire people like Dr. Singh and Osman Abdullah and people who think out of the box like Matthew Reynolds. And so it takes a system. So we need to be thinking about, we need to think in those terms. What is it going to take us to do the same thing in the future, not through just one person, but through a system that has good communication with a good vision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken, this will be the last comment and we'll move to Uma after.
I think one of the most useful comments that I've heard today was made by Howard Buffett when he said, you need to be able to make mistakes to move forward. And I see the situation now in terms of how we develop projects, et cetera, with what Pat was talking about, long frames and milestones. I think donors don't accept that. The assumption, and I find in most donors when we're writing projects, is they assume that you know exactly what is the right thing you're going to do, and so you have no scope for learning from mistakes or doing things. Now, I know Norm believed in that. I mean, he would come to me when we were starting developing machinery, et cetera, for conservation agriculture, and he would say, do it, even if it might sound crazy. So do we, in today's age, do we have the scope to develop projects that allow the latitude to make mistakes that we learn from?
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to speak about Norm Borlaug, because I had quite a number of interactions with him during the period of the Green Revolution, and subsequently when I was on the advisory committee of the Sasakawa program, and also evaluated some of the Sasakawa projects in the field. And I was also on the selection committee of the World Food Prize when it was first established. So over a number of years, I had quite a lot of interaction with him on those specific... Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. On those specific things. And I think especially having worked on the issues of the Green Revolution in India and looking at Africa and looking at the Sasakawa program, I have to say, and I've done a lot of writing on this issue, so I think there were a number of things which led to the Green Revolution which we must recognize when we are talking about Norman Borlaug. First of all, that was a very tumultuous time in India's history. India was so short of food supply that in a way he was planting his seed on a fertile soil, because there was tremendous need for increasing food production. Nevertheless, I think if one looks at the history of his having to sell his technologies and his ideas in India, and even more so in Pakistan, you realize how much of an uphill battle it was for him. But he had created a lot of allies, including Halder Hansen, who eventually became the DG of CIMMYT, and many others. And so there were fundamental changes in policies, institutions in India, which occurred as a result of like-mindedness of a few donors, the World Bank, USAID, the foundations, etc. And quite frankly, that never existed in Africa. So those conditions that were very ripe for achieving a green revolution in Asia didn't occur in Africa. And despite all his efforts, he could show always that you could increase maize production on the fields. I don't know how many fields I've gone to with him and with Marcos, but we just never had the policy framework. And I was so glad to hear that Bob Hurt and Per Pinstrup Anderson talked about the complexity of getting policies right. And I know that the World Bank colleagues used to be very concerned about Norm talking to the Prime Minister, because they were not sure what he was going to tell them about price policy or land policy. They didn't think that was his comparative advantage, but that never stopped Norm from advising the Prime Minister. But I think the issues on policy and institutions have now become very complex. And when we talk about technical change, we better recognize the complementarity of all those.
Thank you. Are there questions or comments on Uma's area?
Hello. Like, if you attend any conferences or if you go through any research articles, every researcher will talk about how to increase the food production. So my question is, so instead of thinking about how to increase the food production, why don't we think about how to reduce the population? So why don't we influence the policy makers or the governments to cut down the number of kids per family? So unless we do this, so we cannot achieve our targets. This is what my opinion.
Despite all the investment that the CGIR is making in policy research, I think that it is a greatly under-researched area. And I think these questions of price stabilization and providing minimum prices and making consumers and producers happy at the same time, which is the penchant of politicians, we really haven't looked at the fiscal implications of all this. If those same resources were spent in alternative investments in R&D, will we have a much bigger bang for the buck than the way fiscal resources are currently being spent in many countries. I think these are so sensitive issues politically that even economists are shying from addressing them in a way that they should. And I think one of the lessons of Norm Borlaug was that we need to create a lot more capacity in the countries themselves to analyze these issues on a regular basis if we are going to get policy change. It can't occur from the CGIAR or from the donors. And there, I think I agree with earlier remarks that in the same way that the Rockefeller Foundation spent a lot of their limited resources on capacity building in developing countries, we are not doing enough of it. We are spending a lot of research on international research, but not enough on linking that research to the needs of national systems. I think that's one important lesson of what Norm was doing.
Thank you.
That Norman Borlaug was very innovative and impact-oriented person. If he would be today, I think he would analyze the gap. And probably the gap today is smallholder farmers, marginal low-input agriculture, and he would definitely focus on identifying technologies for smallholders, identifying right varieties, identifying right agronomic interventions, and also developing seed systems that would impact on smallholder farmers.
Thank you. We have time for one short comment before we move to Zhonghu.
I'm afraid it will be a little bit long, but I will try to make it short. I wanted to say that Dr. Borlaug, besides being a very good scientist, was very sharp. He went to a rice region, started with Pakistan, but the objective was to push India to get into the game of fighting hunger. So this is a very sharp thinking. If Pakistanis can do it, then the Indians will have to do it. So he stimulated that sparkle that made the Green Revolution. I wanted to say this because this is also part of history.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll pass to our Chinese colleague.
Thank you. I met Norm Borlaug here in 91 and 92, and then when I returned to China, when CIMMYT established an office in 1997. So I received him many times, traveling with him in China for many things. Based on my interaction with him, I think that several points really important. One is his respect to NAS. I think he traveled to many places. He said, I come here to work together with you, not to teach with you. Strong partnership with NAS, I think that's important. The second is, we are in a different system, in a different culture. So he always encourages us to try our best, never give up until you are successful. The third point, he repeated many times in China, I'm too old to wait. You must take action immediately. For example, In the year 2000, he traveled to Sichuan province. He saw a serious rust problem there. And he immediately sent an email to Dr. Raj Ram. And then in the evening, Raj called me. So I went to Raj's hotel in China. And then we initiated short breeding between CIMMYT and Sichuan on rust resistance. And now more than 10 varieties was released. What he would do today, if he's still alive, I think headscape is really an international issue. In China, for example, 2 years ago, half of our wheat with serious scab issue, but no action has been taken so far in China. I think he would argue requesting the Chinese government, maybe together with CIMMYT, to have a global scab initiative to use conventional technology, but also use molecular markers and even GMOs, really to solve the scab issue.
We have some very different points there. Are there comments on perspectives in that particular talk? While people are thinking about that, how do you think Norm would go about commercialising a GM wheat?
Well, I think in China he could work together with private companies and government companies to commercialize. Because I believe, like for scab, it's very difficult to breed really high resistant varieties through conventional method. So he must use molecular markers and GMOs if he could develop a highly resistant variety.
Are there questions or points from the audience?
Good afternoon, everyone. How many are ex-trainees or visiting scientists at CIMMYT? Please raise your hand. Hi. Hi. How many are ex-trainees? Ex-trainees. Come on. Raise your hands. Just to give you an example, the winning team of Ethiopia, you could see two Bikeles there, Badebo, Bedada. They are all from our training program. The point I want to emphasize is that if Dr. Borlaug is here again, strong, depending on his physical capacity, I think he will do and continue interacting and be involved in our training program. Because that is what he wants to do. He wants to teach. He wants to make sure that these scientists going back or researchers going back to their programs knows what they are doing. And sorry, it is non-relevant to those, but I think that is what he will be happy to do, to continue training and teaching, especially he called them researchers with bright eyes, Thank you.
Our designated time for this session was to finish at 5:10. We were never going to be able to do that because we started 20 minutes late. So our amended time was 5:30. We're halfway between the two. I'll be guided by you about how much more discussion you want to have. I think we've got perspectives from every corner of the globe, and I think that's been tremendously valuable. I'm happy to take more questions and comments from the panel or from the floor.
La discusión ha sido muy interesante y podemos seguir con los comentarios o preguntas del panel o del público.
Thank you. Comments from Italy. We were lucky to have Norma Borlaug, Professor Spamineta, and Dr. Kush, and many others in this room in 2003. at a Congress I organized in Bologna. And the reason I organized that Congress was because in 2002, I was called to have some sort of debate on GMOs and technology. And a colleague of mine said the Green Revolution was a total failure. And that kind of ticked me off. And so I decided to organize a Congress where they could get the real thing and start a debate. And there was debate. We were even protested the last day. But this is not the issue. The issue is that I'm afraid that in Italy, things, when it comes down to appreciation of what plant breeding and technology can do, have gone from bad to worse. And I don't see any end to it. And I think this is a very negative backlash, particularly on the possibilities that we have to attract young people, young brand scientists to this sector of science. And so my question to the panel, perhaps, or other people in this room, with what Norma Borlaug would do to increase the, I'm not saying visibility, but appreciation of what we're doing worldwide, particularly in Europe, particularly in Italy, where the affluent yuppies, sorry, I don't want to be provocative, but sometimes perhaps you have to, they do not have an understanding of what's happening or what's going on, but yet, because policy, as rightly so was said, is very important, has a huge effect on the political behavior that the politicians, the policymakers, the decision makers do, and also have an impact on science. So next year we will have Expo 2015. 20 million people are expected, 20 million. And the core theme will be food security and nutrition. So it would be a wonderful opportunity to play the drum on how science and technology can benefit towards this direction. And what is happening right now is that the whole initiative is falling pretty much hostage of the organic farming movement. I have nothing against it, or the slow food movement. So I think this is a wasted opportunity. So I wonder what the Norma Borlaug would do for this.
Where you go, Pat? Phil? Anyone want to have a crack at that?
¿Alguien quiere comentar al respecto?
I thought Ronnie Kaufman was very articulate yesterday in saying that Norm would have been very proactive in pointing out the consequences of what he would have thought would be disinformation, and probably would have very actively promoted biotechnology, I would think. And I think one of the challenges for the CG system and the scientific community as a whole is what can it do to promote more objective information on GMOs, which is not seen to be captured by interest groups. And I think what the civil society and some elements of the civil society are doing are saying that this is a conspiracy of multinationals to make developing countries much more dependent on external technology, in much the same way that the Green Revolution had been maligned. And by the way, it surprises me when I go to India, I still read some things which say Green Revolution was a bad thing for India. So I'm sure that that will continue. But is there a way to try to create a scientific community which is completely objective and not captured by any particular interest group? I think that is the challenge that we have, since we don't have Norm anymore.
I have a daughter who is a science communicator, and her points to me regularly are that scientists are terrible at modern communications. That when it comes to the media, it's very easy for Greenpeace to create fear in a one-part sentence grab. And scientists in reply can't get below a paragraph, often below a page. And I think that we have to learn to be better at putting our messages together. And it's not something we probably spend enough time thinking about. So we have 3 further comments. I think Matthew first, Tony second, and Ron third.
Yeah, hi. I was told yesterday by an old friend, also a representative of the CG, going back to Pat's point and others, that the CG represent the donors. Now, I have to say, I wonder a little bit about that. What's their mechanism? Because there's a lot of donors, and pretty sure they don't represent all of the donors equally, anyway, at least. But then I asked, well, what about the clients we serve? How well do the CG represent the NAS? And what about, actually, come to that, what about getting a little bit of farmer participatory policy making by the CG? That might be quite nice too. So I wonder if Norm was around today, whether he might actually be trying to broker that kind of deal between the NAS and the donors and maybe even the farmers to get the CG to really deliver what we really need.
I'd just like to make the point, I think the world's a lot more complex than it was 40 years ago. Countries are different. Africa is very different from South America, very different from South Asia, and very different from East Asia. So you need different approaches now. Common sense policy making doesn't work any longer. It has to be evidence-based, and that's what Uma is telling us about. Common sense plant breeding doesn't work any longer. It's much more complicated. Common sense agronomy might work in Africa, but it won't work necessarily in Australia or in China. It's just much more complicated, and unfortunately getting the message across about GM crops, it is complicated. You can't get it across in a one-sentence statement, and I just don't know how we beat that one, Andy. Thank you.
Ron DePau, Canada. My question is, we have 1 billion people in the world in a food deficit situation. This represents a terrific pent-up demand. So the question is, what would Norm do? What do you think could be done by way of changing the economic structures or the policies or whatever that is required that would provide opportunity for these people to engage in economic activities, so that they engage in whatever kind of an activity, so that they would be brought into the economic sphere, so that they could purchase food, because we know the farmers can produce more than what they are right now if they were adequately compensated.
I can do it.
Just picking up on that and perhaps linking back to Tony's comment about the complexity of the situation in terms of both. The other aspect I wanted to raise is I think the complexity of the science feeding into innovations in agriculture has increased dramatically over the last several decades, in the sense that if you look at where the innovations that are used in agriculture and trace them back to their technological roots, increasingly a lot of those roots are falling outside the narrow confines of food and agricultural R&D and spilling in from more basic biology, informatics sciences and things of that nature, which we don't normally consider part of our sort of purview. And I think I know US universities and other universities are sort of reinventing themselves and changing the structure of their departments and their relationships. And I find that myself, having been in the CG for 20 years now, looking in outside for 10 years, I see a drift in the CG in terms of its engagement with that level of activity. On our campus, we have a Cargill Centre for Microbial and Plant Genomics, which Ron helped build, and quite a few of it's on the Ag campus, and quite faculty have their main affiliation over in health sciences and so forth. So there's this serious blurring of the boundaries, I think, between what constitutes food and agricultural R&D and the rest of science. And I think it adds to Tony's complexity of sort of opening up the CG and engaging in that. And particularly, it's different for different parts of the world. So, some numbers I've put together: Sub-Saharan Africa is still only managing about a 6 to 7% market share in R&D for food and ag R&D. If you look at total science spending, which now worldwide tops $1.1 trillion, Sub-Saharan Africa constitutes less than 1% of that total. And so if you think about the sort of technological and scientific hurdles in sub-Saharan Africa, they're quite different than they are from a Brazil or parts of Asia and so forth. And I think those markets are getting very segmented and bifurcated in ways that just add to the complexity and move us away from a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to sort of spillovers and so forth.
Thanks, Phil. We have Wayne over here, and I think at that point we probably have time for one comment from Pat, and then we need to bring this session to a close.
Andy, a comment from someone who's about to join the CGIR. I suspect that Dr. Borlaug would be a very strong advocate for science and technology. And I suspect as well would be seeking a single voice for GM coming from the CGIR to ensure that it had the confidence and boldness that's appropriate.
Thanks, Wayne. Pat.
I'd just like to congratulate Tony on his last point. We cannot fall into the trap of the Greenpeaces of putting out half information and wrong statements. And so trying to boil it down to a one-sentence thing that we cannot assure is right, we cannot do.
Okay. I think we've had a fantastic discussion. Thank you all for your contribution. And I'd like the audience perhaps to thank our panellists and to thank yourselves. What happens next is a poster session, so I'd commend to you the posters that are on display. Sorry? And I'd just recommend you walk past Tony Fisher and have a look at his new book that's about to be launched, and you can book a copy from him.